SuperTalk Mississippi media production.
Lonnie Sporting Goods has the best selection of firearms, hunting items, and all types of outdoor gear from the best brands. If you want reliability, durability, and performance, Lonnie Sporting Goods in Corinth is your destination. Check out our Facebook at lonnie's.sportinggoods.
It's time for True American Heroes for the Record with Jack Rutland. Another exclusive on SuperTalk Mississippi 102.1 FM. Many of our heroes have taken their stories with them to the grave. But this show is about the stories and personal experiences of these veterans.
Well, it's an honor to be here today with another one of our veterans as we have another segment of True American Heroes for the Record. And today we're honored to have with us a retired United States Air Force Reserve veteran who wore the uniform of his country for about 30 years. And he's pretty old at this time, and so he's in here with his walker, but he's moving around pretty good. I'm glad to have with me, and honored to have with me, retired Colonel Ronald Rutland, and yes, there is some relation. He happens to be my younger brother. But Ron has a unique story and experience to share with us because Ron was in the service for about 34 years and serving his country. And a good part of that, early on in the 70s and 80s, was during what many people know in history as the Cold War. Kind of a unique title. But Ron, first of all, glad to have you with us. Thank you for making yourself available to come in and share some of these experiences that I know are going to be interesting. We're glad to have you back in Mississippi visiting.
Well,
Texas.
The point is you blackmailed me, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Any way I can get you in here. Tell us a little bit, when you graduated from Mississippi State, went on to flight school, got your wings, your first few years in the Air Force, regular Air Force, you were instructor in ATC. And then did you have an opportunity, or were you told you were going to SAC? How did that happen?
For most of us, it was just a surprise, you're going to Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, and fly 135 tankers. And no, we don't for a long time, especially after Vietnam, if we were lucky to get an airplane, we were tickled to death because a lot of guys had to go into what we call rated supplements where they were not flying airplanes. But
you had an excess of pilots.
We had an extreme excess of pilots. We had a RIF, a reduction in force at my squadron, and we lost probably equivalent of 80 pilots who were just out the door. And a lot of them were Vietnam veterans, but we didn't have the airplanes or the need for them, so they were gone.
So going to SAC and Dyess Air Force Base, this meant you still had a job you were glad to have.
I could push the throttle up and go fly every once in a while. I just did not have a full understanding exactly what it meant to be in Strategic Air Command. And you would have thought maybe I might have because Dad retired in 61, and he was in Strategic Air Command, and but he didn't fly. He was in charge of special weapons at Eglin Air Force Base.
Mm-hmm. And I know that once you got into SAC, that's a totally different world. I mean, it was. I can remember early on as a youngster being a dependent of an Air Force. An Air Force brat, I guess, is what I was. There was something special about anybody that was involved in SAC. They had a lot of clout because they were the ones that were the deterrent during the Cold War. I remember the slogan for SAC was "Peace is our profession," but the fact is that SAC was all about war.
Yes, we constantly, and I'll be honest with you, everybody in the Air Force and military, that was their reason for the military is to be ready to go at a moment's notice. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Strategic Air Command sitting alert with nuclear weapon on airplanes and tankers to refuel them, not counting the missiles, which was another great group that sat on the ground, and then the Navy, the Triad, the Navy with their Polaris missiles. Mm-hmm. I'm dating myself with that one, but the Navy into Air Force. So we had gave our national leaders a little bit of an option. But if we ever pushed a button, they'd all launch at once, and we'd go do that. Yes, the change was remarkable from a peacetime training environment into a mindset in which, at a moment's notice, we would go to war, and that mindset, as far as the crews were concerned, whether it would be the Navy or the Missileers or the air crews, we trained to be taking off, and I hate the term, but it's a term that was coined by Winston Churchill, and basically we recognized at the end of World War II and what Stalin had going on in Europe and what he was trying to do. Strategic Air Command was actually stood up in 46 at Bolling Air Force Base, and then finally got their headquarters and they moved to Andrews. But what they did, in order for them to stand up, the Department of Defense, the War Department and Department of Defense now, stood down Continental Air Command. And that was the command that guarded America during World War II. And our dad was actually assigned to Continental Air Command.
Right.
So SAC took their initial cadre, the headquarters group, and started building. And we had such a huge draw from what was left of the bombers and the bomber pilots. We started out with piston. B-29 is probably one of our first, and upgraded engine 29, which we called B-50. Carried nuclear weapons, and we also used made them tankers called KB-50s. And but our first jet that we really got in Strategic Air Command was the B-47. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful airplane, swept wing, fast, easy to fly. But on the ground, it was just like a waddling penguin. It was funny to look at. And they had quite a few ground accidents because it was just hard to handle. Yeah. On the ground, in the air, she was a sweetheart. But and we started getting the shortly after that, we got the B-58 Hustler, which is supersonic. And along those lines, we started looking at other ones. We had the B-36 bomber, but it was slow. But it could fly all day long on its gas inside it. So we had a myriad of airplanes as we were transitioning from the prop world era into the jet. And so, basically that's what that's all about. So, and we got to the point where right now we're flying B-52s just like they did in the 50s.
Yep.
So those airplanes are as old as I am.
That's right. Well, you were in ATC, and then you got the opportunity to get with SAC, which I remember that happening, and I thought how neat it was that you were in SAC and our dad had been in SAC. Ron, that's an air crew in SAC was a really unique position because of the way you guys, the way the DOD and the government decided that it needed to be done. So we'd always be on alert.
Always.
All right. Give us a breakdown of what was expected of air crews. You were able to do this and this and this within a certain number of minutes. Give me just a quick rundown of that.
Well, first of all, the rest of DOD and even the political leadership really didn't have this brainchild. It was Curtis LeMay who recognized that when the Russians started developing weapons that could come to us so quickly, we need to be able to react at a moment's notice. So we sat, or basically we call sat alert, sit on alert, and it was a alert facility parked within less than 50 yards from the airplane.
So alert facility, you're just talking about a house, and in some cases, some of the ones I've seen were partially underground, and that's where the crews stayed while they were on alert.
All the beds were underground. The top was the chow hall and our briefing rooms where we did our studies. The whole time we were on alert, we were training. We were constantly doing what we needed to do to go down the runway, and we would constantly get exercises that would come from Strategic Air Command headquarters, and basically they called an alert or a klaxon, and we'd run the airplane, start the engines, and we were timed. We had a certain amount of time. We had to get everything done, button up, and ready to taxi. Sometimes we even taxied. We had a few accidents with those because you're talking super-weighted, heavy-weighted airplanes.
How many planes would be on alert at a base?
It depended on the base. At Dias, had 4 bombers and 4 tankers. Then that increased after I left. At Loring, we had 6 and 6, and then we had 6 bombers and 8 tankers because we had different, not necessarily just refueled our bombers, but we might have even other things we'd refuel.
How long did it take you to get in the air from the first time you heard the horn go off?
How long could it or should it?
What was the approved time?
Well, if we taxied and went to the runway, we would do what we called a MIDAL, minimal interval takeoff. And we were anywhere from 12 to 15 seconds behind the first airplane in front of us. And he'd be 15 seconds behind us and 50 seconds after us. And because we were using old technology engines, it would be flat black. Yeah, with smoke and everything. But, brother, we'd be in the air probably, let me just give you a number, 5 minutes.
So from the time the horn went off in the alert shack and everybody starts running to jump in their trucks, they go out to their aircraft, they start their cold aircraft,
yes,
and they taxi out on the runway, and you're ready to take off.
Push the throttles up.
5 minutes.
Yep. Now, the tail end Charlie, nobody wanted to be tail end Charlie because he might be 8 minutes and he may not make it off. And that was not so true for Dias because we were mid-America and,
that's right.
and it would take longer for them to strike us. But when I was at Loring Air Force Base, we were a restricted alert. 99% of the time, we couldn't go anywhere on base where I could at Dias. I could go to the gym. I can't do that because the Russian subs held us in too close. That's right.
Too short of time.
The world changed. Everything changed. Strategic Air Command had its purpose, but it changed.
All right, we're coming up on a break here, and we're going to come back. We're going to talk about his experience with some Russian aircraft up close and personal. And what it was like for a surprise, a really shocking alert one night when they weren't expecting one. So we'll be right back. Colonel Ron Rutland, U.S. Air Force Reserves, retired, and his experience in the Strategic Air Command. Well, welcome back. I'm honored today to have as our guest on True American Heroes for the Record, retired Colonel Ron Rutland, United States Air Force Reserves, and we're talking a little bit about his experiences in the Strategic Air Command, which he served for about 8 years before he got into some other areas of the military. So Ron, let's talk a little bit about, you were at Dias Air Force Base, which was in Texas, and then you ended up at Loring Air Force Base. But you had two experiences that I think are really interesting. One at Dias about an alert and the way that you were supposed to be informed that it was an exercise or training, and something happened on that particular night in the middle of the night.
Well, I have to laugh because we were never told up front when there was going to be an exercise. They just blow the klaxon whenever they needed to see and exercise the entire alert force and making sure that we were running like a smooth machine. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of people don't realize is that we had 15th Air Force, we had 8th Air Force, we had 2nd Air Force. We had huge numbers of airplanes on alert. So it was kind of a different feel, and sometimes they wouldn't do all of them at once. They would do a sector, an air division, or another sector all around the state. So they were constantly testing us. But our wing commander came out one day and said, we had an accident up at Rickenbacker Air Force Base where they did what we called, the crews called an elephant walk, and that was basically the airplanes would start and actually taxi to the whole line, because that would be the messages would tell them to do. They'd get to the whole line, and then they'd end the exercise, and we'd taxi back in, top off on fuel, and go.
Okay, now let me just make one thing clear. Once the klaxons, the horns go off in the alert shack, and you guys get to your aircraft, then the rest of the instructions are coming through your radio into the aircraft telling you what to do next.
Well, yes, it was. So the first thing, the klaxon was an automatic engine start. We started the engine when that horn went off. That was it.
But you had to get, it depended on, you had
We
a lot
still
of, if
had
you were
to decode.
asleep, if you were eating
Yes,
and all
yes.
that kind of stuff,
You
all that
left it.
stopped,
Yep.
and you went to your plane and you started engines.
We only had one fear for all the alert crews in SAC was that you're sitting on the can when the horn went off. That was our biggest fear.
Thanks for that bit of information.
Yeah, but it was just it was just something. Oh, just please don't let that happen. But
tell us about that event in Dice.
we had been told by the wing commander had an accident and 2 airplanes had taxed together and a few people had lost their lives, and we would not be allowed to have any klaxons or horns at night. Nights had been postponed until we had approved lighting that would light up the entire alert area so we could see better.
Okay.
Because the accident they had up at Rickenbacker Air Force Base, they was pitch black and they taxied into each other. And but this particular night, and I mean it was the same week that the wing commander came out and gave us our oncoming briefing, and so about 11:30 at night, we kind of kick back. We wear gym shorts and our gym stuff, and so we're not in our uniform, our flight suits, which was 99.9% of the time. We were always ready to run the airplane and get in, strap in, put on our parachute, put on our helmet, and be ready to taxi as necessary, depending on what the exercise told us to do. Lots of times you start engines and shut them down.
Okay.
But this particular night, it was about 11:30, that horn went off, and I remember distinctly hearing it, and it was just such a, almost, what's that? And several people kind of looked at each other and went, this was not supposed to happen. Now, this all happened about a heartbeat, and next thing you know, they're going out the doors of the alert facility, headed toward the airplanes to get them cranked. Well, my flight suit and my boots were downstairs, so I had to run downstairs, grab my boots in one hand, boots in the other, took off. Got the airplane.
And wait a minute now. You're getting dressed while you're running to your airplane.
No, I didn't get dressed. I had my gym clothes on, and I had my flight suit in one hand and boots in the other as I'm running to my airplane, about 110 yards. That's where my airplane was parked. And so I got there and got up and threw my stuff down and got in the seat, put my helmet and my parachute on. I was still in my gym clothes. I didn't have time to put them on.
Good night.
Yeah, and so we got them all fired up. And about that time, my navigator, Chuck, said something over the radio, and I said, what? And a very quiet, easygoing man, but he said a curse word, and that's what got my attention. And I said, what? And he said, it's an actual. And I said, it's just stunned silence for a second. What do you mean actual? This is not an exercise. We are to button up, taxi, and take off. And about this time, my co-pilot jumps out of the seat and tells him, and of course the other airplanes are all calling the command post and say message, which says repeat it. Because they all got the same thing, and they couldn't believe it, so they're making sure they didn't mess up, and
so
they
Ron,
made command post say it again.
So what's going through their minds at this point? First of all, they're surprised because the klaxon goes off at night after you've been told it wouldn't.
Yep.
And then you guys get there, and there's nothing saying it's an exercise.
Exactly.
So the very first thing in your mind is you're going to war.
Well, it's funny. I never thought about going to war. I just knew I had to get off the ground. And that was the only thing that was going through my mind.
Thinking about your mission.
I got to get in the air. I got to get in the air. I got to get in the air. My boom operator ran up. My co was watching. They decoded it again and again. And finally they said, let's go. And my crew chief was so shook up. He was 19 years old, and he was crying. We get him on board. We button up, and the airplanes are coming out of their parking spots as hard as they can. And
you just said something. I didn't know you took your crew chiefs with you.
We did on that mission.
I got you.
Because we may land where there is no base. We may land at a civilian field.
No, that's right.
And he would be the one who would turn our airplane around.
Yeah.
So my crew chief went with me.
Wow.
And he got flight pay back then, and that was supposedly a pretty good job. But this particular night shook up a few of them, as it did all of us. And we're racing to the end of the runway. The wing commander had his blue military trousers on, his pajama top on, and his slippers, because he was caught off guard too, because he knows when all the exercise is. He's the only one that knows when the exercise comes. This one came out of the blue, so he put on his pants over his pajamas, jumped in his car, and ran out. So he's sitting there in the throat, and he's looking up, and all of a sudden the airplanes start moving, boom, and we're gone.
Wow.
And we were racing to the end of the runway, and we were going to take off. And before we got to the end of the runway, we got the code word that shut us down. And we came to stop. We waited there about a half hour, and then finally we taxied back in. So about 5 hours after it was all over, we got back in the alert facility, and but there was nobody sleeping. The adrenaline pump had been hit so hard.
Sure, absolutely.
And it wasn't until sometime later, and then it glitched again about 2 weeks later. It was a computer said, kind of like war games, something was inbound, and it just saw what we call a flare. It saw a hot spot and thought it was a missile. It was not.
Whew. Well, I'm sure that kind of got a lot of young guys' attention. And and Ron, like every other vet, I could talk about 3 hours and listen to your stories. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I really want our folks to hear about your experience when you were stationed at Loring Air Force Base, which is the furthest north base in continental United States.
No, it's not. We're way up there, but there's another one real close.
With the host.
Yeah, I can. You're my brother. But anyway, quick and dirty, we had just been on alert. And as we were coming off alert, the command post called my crew and says, "You're now on standby for alert." Well, we knew what that was. There's a number for it in which we would go on alert for Air Defense Command at that time, and it happened to be F-15s out of Otis, a guard unit. And I got a phone call about 2 in the morning. Ran back down to the alert facility. The crew was there. They handed us a package and said, take off immediately. Everything had already been done on the ground, so we just ran the airplane, cranked up, and took off. Well, while we were taking off, I didn't realize that the 2 F-15s that were sitting up there on air defense alert taxied out behind us. And if we don't take off, they can't take off because they got to have our fuel to do the mission. So we went first, went down the runway, and we were heavy, and we used all that 2 miles of runway, and we stagger into the air like we always did in that old airplane. And then the F-15s take off, and I remember one of them called, and he said, well, where are they? I don't see you. I said, well, look down. And he said our landing lights were showing the forest below us because we couldn't climb that fast. Hours later, we went out over the North Atlantic and with the F-15s on our wings, and then we got in contact with another airplane out there that said we had an inbound Russian Bear, which was their turboprop bomber, and they vectored us in to him, and I saw him at a distance. It was daybreak. The 15s immediately broke formation and went to him. I turned toward him too, so I could keep my 15s close to me and him in sight. So I was off to the side, probably about 3 miles. I was sitting there looking at, and what I remember distinctly, and it was surprising to me, I could hear his engines at altitude. They were so loud. And so I said, well, I don't have anything to do here. So I took mine and went over and got in behind the Bear and got close. And we're looking up at the gunner, and I can see him, and he can see us. And he waved, and I waved, and we all waved and just kind of.
And the old Russian Bear had a tail gunner.
He had a tail gunner. Mm-hmm. He was sitting back there looking at us, and we were looking at him. He didn't feel threatened by a tanker, and we didn't feel threatened by him. But about that time, one of my F-15 guys said, I probably wouldn't sit back there with that hot cannon he's got. Okay, we're out of here. So we pulled out about 5 miles and kept him close and followed him. And he went on his way he was coming from Russia going into Cuba. And
they had an incredible range. I mean, it wasn't anything for them to go down,
no refueling.
Go right down the coast and just to test the United States and see how close they could get without having.
That's exactly what it was all about.
Interceptors.
So there's a picture the F-15 guy sent of that bear that we caught that night, and we started up a call, the Bear Hunters Association, Loring Air Force Base.
Well, it's been neat to have you here. Ron's experience as a member of the Strategic Air Command, which is a great part of the Cold War history of our country and our military. Not a well-known, something worthy to be looked at. A lot of Americans lost their lives during the Cold War. It was not considered a shooting war, but yet there was a lot of close calls, as Ron shared the one experience about an alert that he responded to. Ron, thank you for your service to your country. Thank you for your service and wearing the uniform of the United States Air Force and the Air Force Reserves. And this was really interesting. Anything you'd like to say as we go?
Yes, I would, and it's short and sweet. There isn't a guy out there or gal who wore the uniform, whether it was for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10, or retired. There's not a one of us who will ever consider ourselves the hero. Our heroes are the ones that didn't come home.
They're the ones that didn't.
And for every single one of us, they're the ones we think about, we remember, and they're the ones who gave it all. We did what we either had to do or we just loved doing, and that's what I did, being a son of a Air Force Master Sergeant.
Well, the ultimate sacrifice is what most and many paid, and we're free because of them and because of those who wore the uniform and served our country. Once again, for True American Heroes, for the record, thank you.
A SuperTalk Mississippi media production.